This video was brought to you by Squarespace, the best way to make an amazing website. Is the Canon R5 really that terrible with dynamic range? Well, today we will find out as I put it head to head with my Sony A7S III that is rated excellent with dynamic range in a variety of different scenarios. We did a color test yesterday. If you didn't check that out yet, make sure you guys watch that. There's some very interesting results. And some of you guys mentioned dynamic range. Now, you guys probably saw Gerald Undon's excellent reviews where he stated that the A7S III gets 13 stops at a dynamic range, which is cinema camera level, compared to just 11 stops on the R5. But what does that mean in the real world? I'll show you exactly what I found both with standard footage, with flatter or more natural neutral footage. We're gonna look at S-Log footage, and we're even gonna test out some 8K RAW to see what the difference actually is. Now, of course, if you're shooting a scenario like this, which is part of my color video, you're not seeing that much of a difference. You know, the whole scene is nice and soft. For a lot of movies, you have nice lighting, you have diffusion, and you don't see a difference. But some of you guys pointed out this shot right here, you guys could see that the Sony, in those shadows, we are getting more detail. You can see more of that detail that's not being crushed, while at the same time, the building, the highlights are being retained a little bit better. This is a standard profile. This one doesn't jump out as much as the next one did right over here. Once again, a standard profile. And we're seeing that for the Canon in the shadows, they're pretty much gone. And then the highlights are actually a little bit brighter as well, where the A7S III captures more dynamic range. Now, the one that stood out to me the most, and some of you guys as well, was this scene. This was in the morning. And not only do we have a lot more shadow detail on the Sony, you also, if you look at the sky, the Sony sky isn't blown out, where the Canon sky is blown out as well. So those are our standard profiles, and you're much better off shooting with the Sony there, it's clear. Now, what about if you're using a more flat, neutral profile? Well, in this case, I shot outside. This is a tough spot, and I actually exposed for the shrubs, kind of the greenery over here, and we have some hot spots from the sun. And you guys could see that with the Sony, the highlight roll-off is more pleasing and we're having more highlight details there. It's a nice looking image, whereas with the Canon R5, even in this neutral profile, as Canon calls it, you're getting a lot more blown out highlights. Now, there are a lot more highlights here. The clouds are moving around, but even where the patterns match up, it definitely looks a lot more pleasing on the Sony. I do want to quickly add that the Sony is easier to get proper exposure with. They give you extra tools. For example, I can do spot metering. I can move my point across and I can dial in exactly where I want my exposure to be. So it definitely is easier, but I did shoot all these tests at many different exposure levels so I can dial it in to make sure I have the best exposure for both, especially as we go into testing out log, which will give you better dynamic range, and also raw, which we're going to take a look at in just a second. But first, let me give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. Not only is it incredibly easy to make a website, it's literally drag and drop, you have a lot of customizations, but Squarespace sites work everywhere. They scale automatically to your tablet, to your phone, to your laptop or desktop computer. It doesn't matter if you need a portfolio, a blog, e-commerce, or anything else, Squarespace has got you covered. It's incredibly simple, it's affordable, and SEO tools are built in so people will actually find your website online. Start your free 2-week trial with no credit card required by going to squarespace.com/MaxYuryev or by using the link down below, and when you're ready to launch, you're going to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. So here is the first example of switching to log mode. As you guys could tell, we definitely get better dynamic range with the Canon R5. That huge patch of blown out highlights, it's still somewhat blown out. Not too bad though. It actually pulled back a lot of it. And as far as the Sony, it got a little bit better, but not as much of a difference as you had with the Canon. So it seems like Canon's regular profiles, as you guys saw earlier, definitely lack in dynamic range. Now, of course, this is just one scene, and it wasn't perfect because the clouds were moving. So let's take a look at another scene. In this one, I exposed for the highlights instead, and I had my wife stand in the shadows. And looking at both, I'm really surprised by how close the results were. Of course, I had to push up the mids. I added in contrast. I wanted a nice contrasty image. and they both look great. Now, the R5 has a little bit more noise, but it's also finer noise because I am using the 4K HQ mode. So it's 8K down to 4K. So it's oversampled and that compresses noise. It looks really, really good. Now, this scene had much higher dynamic range than this. Here you look at it, it looks like we're all standing in the shade, where in reality, it was super bright. And if I shot this with regular standard footage, she would be completely dark if I exposed for the highlights, or vice versa. I'm really surprised by how good the Canon looks. Now, this is where I have to come in and say that I'm not using the standard LUT that's built into Final Cut. With that LUT, the dynamic range is really cut down, and I can imagine how it looked. It looked terrible. So I did some research. I went on Canon's site. I downloaded the LUT pack on the page for the R5, and they have a version 2 LUT. Maybe that's just fine-tuned for the specific camera compared to whatever is built into Final Cut, because it looks a lot better. And in this scene, if Gerald Undon's test was using this newer LUT, I'm not exactly sure how he tested with. Maybe it's just perfect 11 stops difference, and that's why we're not seeing that much of a difference. So I had to go to a tougher scene. So this is really where we're pushing the dynamic range. This is inside of my house. We have really bright highlights outside. The inside isn't too dark, but this is a typical real estate type shoot. So the R5, if we look outside, we see that that driveway is actually blown out completely. It's blending in with the street, blending in with the grass in the car. Some of the trees are missing. A lot of that is gone. Whereas with the Sony, we see the difference between the driveway in the cul-de-sac, the street, some of the roofing you could still see. You definitely get a lot better dynamic range. Is this 2 stops in the real world? I'm really not sure. I definitely would prefer the Sony. And with the Sony, we actually get a little bit better contrast as well on the inside. And we get a little bit less noise as well, although the noise pattern is larger because we have a 4K sensor compared to an 8K sensor. Now, I also mentioned that we're going to take a look at RAW. RAW did get a little bit better, but it didn't get that much better. We're seeing a little bit more dynamic range, specifically in the grass, a little bit in the car, and we also do get more noise with the RAW as well. A little bit more detail, but also more noise. So as far as dynamic range, I don't think it's worth shooting RAW with the R5 if you just want better dynamic range. That 4K HQ oversampled mode, that's actually better in terms of overheating than the 8K RAW. It looks fantastic. I love how that image looks. So is the R5 that bad in terms of dynamic range? I don't think it's as bad as a lot of people are saying. In the standard profiles, yes, it looks pretty dang terrible. And in the Canon log footage, yes, you could tell a difference if you're really pushing the dynamic range like this scene right here, but it still looks pretty good, and it's way better than what we've gotten before. Now colors, I think the Canon's a little bit better in the log. The Canon's also easier to deal with when you're grading log footage. I'm much quicker with it, even though I've shot Sony for quite a bit longer. So let me know your thoughts. Is the Canon as bad as you expected? What do you think about the differences? And is dynamic range a good enough reason to switch over to the A7S III? Of course, I'm a Sony shooter. I have 3 A7S IIIs now, and I do have this R5, but I'll probably be letting it go. Even though I shoot Sony, I want to say if I wanted to get some of the features that the R5 has, such as 8K RAW, or even just a little bit easier usability and better IBIS system, better rear LCD screen, better colors, I don't think this is that big of a difference to make it a deal breaker or have it be something that you really want to complain about. Definitely did better than I expected. So thank you guys for watching. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. If you didn't see the color comparison yet, definitely go and check it out. It's right over there. Click that circle to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.